Hello and welcome to Beyond the Scenes. This is a space where I have interviews with friends, people in the film industry, artists, creatives in general. My name is Andres Cuervo, and I have the privilege of having in the studio my good friend Justus Page. Welcome, Justus.
What's going on?
That's great to have you here.
Man, that's good to be here.
Awesome. We met working on set,
Oh, yeah.
in some very interesting projects that that I will not mention here.
Yes.
But working in the industry, you get to meet very interesting people. You get to talk to them a little bit on the breaks and at lunchtime, but nothing like having a conversation in the studio at the podcast. So
No.
I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
Because I agree. Like you get always a bit of a taste of the kind of people that you work with, what they're like in those moments you were talking about. But it's always nice because you always want to work with them again so you can have more of those moments. But this is just a way of imagine that, just doing it yourself instead of just waiting for another job to come around to have that moment.
Yeah, and the fact that most of the time we're behind the camera, working either in lighting or with, the camera department. Very few times you get the chance to be in front of the camera, kind of tell your story and, just connect with the audience. And part of that connection that we had on set is our love for languages, our love for history, our love for culture, and sometimes kind of like the oddness in our stories that, makes us stand out either for the curly mustache or the military fatigues.
Yeah,
But we'll talk about that here while we do the interview. But just very curious about, you coming from Utah all the way here to Atlanta. Tell me a little bit about your Utah history.
Oh man, I mean, I wasn't born in Utah. I was born in Virginia, not too far south of DC, but we moved to Utah when I was super little, when I was like 1 or 2 years old. So I might as well have been born there because I lived there my whole life till I moved here to Georgia. But yeah, man, it's an interesting upbringing. I think everybody thinks that where they come from is a unique place, but I tell people that Utah is exceptionally unique.
Yeah.
And it may not always be obvious on the surface, but if you float around for a little bit, you'd be like, there is something kind of, depending on your perspective, either weird or interesting.
Is it salt water?
Yeah, exactly. It's what I tell people is the smog. The smog eats your brain, and then
Yeah. Now, when I think about Utah, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is, the Mormon colony, the settlement. And I thought they were from Utah, but as a history aficionado and passionate about history, you were just explaining to me how that actually happened.
Yeah, the Mormons came from the Midwest. They were fleeing persecution, and they fled across the country, and then they got to what is now the Salt Lake Valley, and they came over the mountain, and they said, "This is the place." And they decided this is where we were going to build our new home, our new civilization. And for me, that story always read as we've trekked across the whole country, terribly miserable journey in the 1840s, and they came over a fairly hard mountain climb and were like, you know what, this is good. I don't want to walk anymore, and I have, in my family lineage, we have pioneer blood in there, part of the Mormons that came across the country. So, that's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Explain why I like walking and traveling across the country so much. But yeah, it's they've only been there since the 1840s, and they built they built it from the ground up as if it wasn't already inhabited, but you know how that goes.
But you were also kind of explaining to me that Utah, as well as other states from the west and the south, were part of Mexico.
Yeah, until they were ceded to the United States after the Mexican-American War. Yeah, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, that was all, nominally. Texas is a little more of an interesting story there, but yeah, all those other states were part of Mexico, and then, not too long before that, part of Spain. And then they became American overnight, and then they just got turned into territories. So, at that time, what's funny to me actually is that at the time that the Mormons had settled in Utah, at that precise moment, it was still part of Mexico.
He was still part of
Because it was 1847, or I might be misremembering history. It's either 1847 or 1849. I live in Georgia now. You got to cut me some slack. But you know, the process of actually transferring territories to the United States isn't just like I signed a piece of paper, wham bam done. This is America now. You know, like it takes a little more time and disassociation of like the Mexican institutions and stuff, and what government presence there was, and withdrawing that, replacing it with American. So at the time, they were basically illegally immigrating to what was technically Mexico and founding their own little tiny republic there, and then
There was no wall.
yeah, exactly. So they illegally immigrated to Mexico, and then that was sort of the point. Like they were, America had not been very kind, despite the fact these were all American people. The idea was the religious persecution they dealt with everywhere else in America. They were looking for a fresh start away from everybody, and then very shortly after they, the place they had settled in was suddenly now America also, like in almost very rapid succession, which I had to imagine was a bit of a sigh.
But at that point, they had already made their land, their rules, their lifestyle.
They were trying. Like, the thing is, like, anybody who is from or is familiar with Salt Lake knows that like that valley is not super friendly for like cultivation. like we know it now because it's a large area. The Salt Lake Valley houses a huge part of the Utah state population. Mountain to mountain, north to south is just all populated. But when they got here, it was not the case. It was brush. It was dry brush, high altitude desert, not very good for farming. Like it was a very hard several years for them terraforming the earth in a way that they could actually survive off the land there, and had to do a lot of trading and bartering with native tribes to stay alive at the time, because it's like not very friendly for living, really, which is why it hadn't really been inhabited by anybody permanently, even native settlers in the Salt Lake Valley anyway. Because it's not. I mean, the Great Salt Lake is like right there, with the water table, all of that, and its high salt content is. Yeah, it's like rough land to live in.
Interesting. I see how we dive into history right away. That's how passionate you are.
Myself.
But going back to your side of the history, I mean, the Mormons went to Utah. They saw the land. They say, "Oh, this is a promised land."
Yeah.
2 years old, your mom goes to Utah, and they're like, "Oh, this is a promised land."
Yeah.
And you're growing up in Utah.
Yep.
Where do you think that your passion for the arts and performing and media came about?
I think there's like a lot of us. There's always a little bit of a bug in there. It's just the right set of circumstances that allow you to see it. And I was definitely somebody who was looking for a lot of self-expression when I was younger. Like I tried my hand at sports. I was really bad at sports because I was just a very timid child and scared of the ball, whatever the ball was. I did really good at karate, but according to my mom, karate was expensive, so we couldn't do karate forever. So my mom was able to, through a family friend, learned about a youth musical theater program that I started doing when I was pretty young. I was like 10 or 11, I guess. And really quickly fell in love with that. Like, I think I went to like a class just to test it out, and I was like, oh yeah, this is great. I want to do this.
Cool.
Sign me up. And got involved in that really early. I did that for years, doing musical theater, being on stage, helping out the teacher with stuff behind the scenes and stuff like that. Even as a little kid, for me, that was like, it was awesome. And it was like some much needed socialization for me as a kid. I didn't have the best time in public school, being, a half Hispanic kid in the burbs. So it was a good way for me to just, be around people of a similar kind of ilk, who were also just like wanting to be expressive and sing and dance and all of that.
What were kind of like the things that you had to face during that period of your life when it comes to like being a mixed race and being in Utah, being different?
I feel like for me, it's always been really complicated history, because I'm not, it's fairly obvious, I think, to people who know me that I'm fairly what you may consider like white presenting, we say, because I grew up in what was a nice middle class suburb that was predominantly white, in the western part of Salt Lake. You know, there's a lot of younger families and stuff like that out there, but you know, it was also, you know, fairly middle class. And you know, while Utah has a decent Latino population, just by socioeconomic reasons, a lot of them were, you know, lower income, and they lived in cities further away that, you know, housed most of them, and so there wasn't quite as many. Like we definitely had like other Hispanic kids in the neighborhood and stuff, and some of my best friends growing up were like some of the only other Hispanic kids around, you know, to a degree, but they were also like me, always like half, you know, like half and half. But yeah, man, it was weirdly tough, and I didn't really think about it much at the time, you know, because I would say when I was younger, I didn't really consider myself Mexican, you know, despite ethnically being so, just because I never really made that association. You know, like I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I was raised by my mom. My dad was in my life, you know, but my dad, you know, didn't grow up speaking Spanish in the household either. So, you know, it wasn't like Hispanic identity wasn't really something I had. So, you know, I always just saw myself as being what I was. So it was confusing to me to be treated when you're young, to be treated like you're, you know, sometimes, I mean, kids are mean, but, you know, a second class citizen for like something you don't even really see yourself as, you know, like that was a little confusing. Like it definitely had some weird, you know, weird things to work out with my, you know, ethnic identity that I didn't really sit down and ponder much till I was a lot older, you know.
Yeah.
At that age, you know, at least I wasn't really thinking much about it. It was like, you know, literally it was just merely like, okay, he's slightly darker skin, you know, like that's all it really is to it. You know, we didn't really have, I mean, like Hispanic was like virtually the only minority. So, you know, I didn't really grow up going to school with anybody who was Asian, with anybody who was black, you know, not really a lot of people who were Jewish, or Eastern European, you know, like a lot of the people were just, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you know, of that ilk. So it was just what there was.
Yeah.
So
Now, do you think that the bullying and the rejection kind of were a force that lead you into focusing more on the arts as an escape?
oh yeah, totally. And I think it, you know, it was subconscious. I definitely, you know, there was no like conscious effort to seek that, I think, but for sure there's definitely like an element when you're in that where you just kind of want to feel seen, I think, you know, for something other than, you know, just whatever the surface is, you know. Like people bullied me because I was, you know, brown, and, you know, to their credit, also because I was weird, you know. I'm not just gonna say they're just bullying me because I was brown. I was a weird guy. I mean, you know me, but like little me was even weirder, more socially timid, you know, because I think the issue I had is the bullying started so early. I think I didn't get enough quality social skills in early. So I just got progressively a little more socially weird as I got older, until about high school when I kind of normaled out. But you know, it's just like a compounding effect. You know, you get bullied because you're brown and you're a little weird. Maybe you're a little annoying because you're a kid, and then, you know, that compounds into now I'm a little weirder because, you know, I'm rebelling against these things people are bullying me for and all that, and it just kind of like stacks itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was something I didn't really think much about in terms of like how it correlated to my love of the arts, for sure. But I realized I was always kind of an arts kid without realizing it, you know. Like I always kind of saw myself for the longest time as more of like an analytical sort. And I think I still am.
Yeah.
You know, my mom is she has her master's in business. You know, she was in accounting my whole life growing up, and now is in like business management for financial companies and stuff like that. So I grew up in a, you know, a very traditional business and accounting kind of household, you know, and I think I inherited some of that acumen from my mom, for sure. But
Which complements your artistic side as well.
in this industry, it absolutely does. But as a kid, you know, I was like, I'm gonna be a psychologist, or, you know, an analyst or something like that, or some form of data scientist, maybe something like that. But, you know, I was always, despite always having these thoughts, the only thing I was actually caring about doing was like art stuff. So I was always a big movie kid. I was definitely the kind of kid who could like watch one movie for like a month straight, just on loop, until like broke the VHS or the DVD, you know, and burnt it out. Totally hyperfixed.
What kind of movies were you watching?
Oh man. When I was younger, it was definitely like Toy Story was my jam. Was probably like the first movie as a kid that I like fell in love with. I was a big fan of like the Thomas the Train movie, like the Magical Railroad, something like that. It's called. The Power Ranger movies were like, oh yeah. And as I got older, it was like stuff like Princess Diaries and Freaky Friday. Like, oh, that was just good fun.
Yeah.
But it's weird because like again, like it's you can never really like see the steps that get you to a certain place until you have that hindsight, right? Because like I was like, oh my gosh, this really to me was a very telling story of like where I was headed in life. Was like I was like 10 years old, I think, and I like came home from school one day. And, you know, my parents both, my mom and stepdad both worked. So they usually weren't home till 5 or 5:30, something like that. So I would get home from school and I would just like hop in the living room and I'd turn on like Turner Classic Movies or something.
Yeah.
And there was one day and I turned on this Humphrey Bogart war film from 1942 called Sahara, directed by the incredible Sultan Korda, who makes another one of my favorite movies. But, you know, at the time, I don't know what compelled me to
And you
like
were
actually
10.
watch this. I was 10 years old watching this black and white war film starring Humphrey Bogart. And it's not like a big action thriller. It's like a weirdly personal journey of like a tank crew surviving alone in the desert trying to get back to safety. And they encounter like the Italians and Germans along the way. And yeah, it's like a whole thing. But I like fell in love with that movie. I was like,
Really?
I this was in the age of TiVo. I TiVo'd this movie and I just rewatched it for like 2-3 weeks straight till the TiVo deleted it. It was like every day I was just watching this movie, you know. And maybe, you know, if I was any wiser as like a little 10-year-old, I would have seen that maybe something historically related or cinema related might have been might have been my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But you don't have that kind of clarity at 10 years old.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. Now, going to theater, you're exposed to be on the stage. You know, sometimes you're, you know, acting, but sometimes when you're in theater, you're working behind the scenes and you're working on props and set or writing. You got that kind of experience as well. But when did you transition to, you know, thinking, oh, now filmmaking is my jam?
That is a semi-tragic story turned into a triumph.
Okay.
Which was I was definitely somebody, as I'd already touched on, who was bullied pretty terribly basically all through public school. And in ninth grade, which in Utah is still middle school, it's not high school, I was one day, just a few days after putting on a play that I helped co-write, by the way, for the school, I was assaulted on the school bus on the way to school one day. And it was a pretty bad incident. And it was bad enough that, you know, when the school found out about it, you know, and they let my mom know about it, my mom just lost it, you know, and the tears were immense. She was so angry at the school for having failed to protect me for all these years. And to be fair, they absolutely did not. School's bullying policy was literally deal with it yourself. Like, don't bother us with this. You know, and she pulled me out of school. She was like, I don't want you going there. I don't know exactly what we're going to do next, but you know, that's over. But there was a kid who lived on our street. He was a bit of a ruffian, but we thought he was a cool guy, you know. But he went to this school called East Hollywood, which was a school for kids who were about to fail out of any other high school, but it was also a film production high school. And they had obviously a lot of stuff to do with acting and music production. That's just a byproduct of that. And it happened to just be around the corner from my mom's work. So I was like, that kind of sounds really cool. You know, obviously I've been doing this musical theater thing for these last several years and I really like that. And I'd be interested in going in that direction. And so we did. My mom was able to call the school and got me in. And a few weeks after being pulled out of public school, I started high school, you know, ninth grade, there. And, my first class at this new school on day one, that I had picked by, you know, I had no knowledge of this at the time, I was just like picking stuff that sounded cool. My first class ever in high school at this new school was a stop motion animation class.
Wow. With like clay or?
Yeah, and 8mm. You know, like hand drawn on 8mm film.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was my introduction to like not only high school, but this school, but also I guess in the longer term, like a beginning of a journey.
That's pretty unique. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so I went there originally because I was, you know, interested in acting and stage work and all this stuff. But very quickly, over a couple of months, I just kept gravitating to like all the film stuff, you know, like because our school would produce, instead of like a big school play every year, the school would produce a feature film run by the students every year.
Okay.
So, you know, the students would be the directors, the costume designers, the wardrobe people, the lighting people, you know, all that. And then the teachers would kind of help be the technical guidance, and they'd, you know, help co-direct it and stuff like that. And the one that they made my ninth grade year was incredible. I remember like watching it and being like just in awe. Like I remember being around some of the classes while they were working on it that year and just being like, wow, that's so cool. Like, I kind of wonder what they're doing, you know. All the while I'm doing like stop motion classes and like, you know, intro to US film history and stuff like that. And then, you know, that was like, I was just so curious, you know. And then that movie came out and we did like a big school premiere. And I remember going to the premiere and watching this movie. And there was just like this moment where I was like, this is so cool. Like, I didn't know, well, something got me so amped up about just like that whole thing. I was so gravitated toward it. But it wasn't until the following year, my sophomore year, when I started making more of my own, like, you know, narrative films outside of like stop motion stuff, that I very, very quickly that year was like, oh no, this. It was like the switch flipped. It was like, this is the thing. This is the thing I want to do with my life.
Now, one thing that I've seen often when you go on social media is these videos of kids in the school, you know, recording with their phone, and just like this mass group of people hitting this girl or this boy, or fighting, or the bullying, spitting on each other. It seems to me, I don't know if it's more aggressive and more prominent than before. But it seems like bullying is a huge problem in our society today. I don't know what you think, having experienced that, and if you see an increase, and what do you think can be done, and why is it so serious of an issue?
Oh man. I think the hard part is it's such a complex problem, like so many things that have that the underlying causes that lead to that happening can be systemic, they can be cultural, they can be socioeconomic. You know, there's a lot of things that are sometimes beyond the control. Like, you know, you can't really like, here's the thing, right? Middle schoolers are jerks, and it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter where you live. You know, those preteens and early teen, when you're that age, you're probably a jerk. You know, you're going through a lot. Your body's changing. You don't understand any of it. There's not a lot of good guidance, at least, you know, especially when I was growing up, about the changing you're going through and how to process those emotions and cope with them in a healthy way. You know, and I think the problem is twofold, in that now the technology is advanced so much that you can now put a device like a phone in the hand of any person. My 2-year-old son can, in some form, I mean, he'll lock my lock screen for like 20 minutes, but you know, in some form, he kind of understands that like this thing does things by push buttons and can open it up, and it has a camera. He knows that, you know, so like, it's such a simple device that is so easy to grasp that we just put in people's pockets. And I think the hard part is we get so desensitized because of the prevalence of the image. You know, it's our ability to capture and see something in any part of the world and have it viewed anywhere sort of commodifies the value of an image, which is a whole other issue into itself. But it means, I think, the act of capturing something is sort of a commodity. And I
So
think,
incentivize, you know, it's not only the bullying that's happening, but the captioning and sharing brings a whole audience that in a way kind of craze for that as well.
yeah, right. And we feel gross about it. Like, I don't know if anybody, if you were to say you just watched a video of like 5 people jumping this dude, that you would be like, oh yeah, and I think that's great, right? Like, in principle, no, but like, yet you're watching it, you know, like there's that part of the human brain that that I think technology has just unfortunately really exploited the gap in our self-regulation. You know, and I think unfortunately kids are just the most susceptible about it because of all the other changes that they're going through. And I think it's a hard world, man. Like, it's hard as an adult having social media, right? And there are definitely times, and I'm guilty of this too. I've virtually quit all social media. I'll like get onto my Instagram and share some stories here and there, but I'm not like a poster. I got rid of my Facebook, because there's just the seeing other people doing things or succeeding in certain things, right? Just the image that you get on social media, what people's lives are like, obviously we all know is total crap. Like, it's not what's actually going on. It's not what's really happening. Like, and let's be honest here, especially in this industry, right? People are always posting like they're working, right? And the reality is we're just trying to show people that we're working just so that maybe they want to hire us. I I feel like I've argued with a lot of people who hopefully are watching this about my personal beliefs about that aspect of it. But you know, it's that sort of pervasive envy that is so easily generated from something like that is magnified when you have kids and teenagers having to deal with those same problems. You know, like seeing their friends do stuff, feeling like they're missing out on things, or that their life is worse because they're seeing images of people doing it any better. You know, and it feels simple. Like people, if you say that out loud, people are like, well, you know, they're not really that dumb. Like we have the capacity to understand that, like, that's what it is. But our brain's chemicals, the emotional processing we do in here, despite the logic that our brain can convince ourselves of, that is sometimes overriding. And as we were just talking about, like when teenagers, that blockage, that mental savage to overcome the emotional reaction is way less prevalent. And I think that makes it hard, man. Like I mean, I grew up in an age where that stuff was kind of booming out into the world, you know, like when I was a kid, we didn't, you know, we got our first like wireless home phone. I remember when I was like, I don't know, 7 or 8. And I still remember our home phone number. You know, and then a couple years later, it was like, okay, my parents have like these Blackberries now, you know, and then soon after it was like, I had like a little track phone that had like installed minutes on it for like making calls. Because I was old enough to be at home by myself after school, and they needed to get a hold of me, you know, and that evolved to, you know, a couple years later, I had a, you know, flip Nokia phone, and then, you know, then suddenly the iPhone comes into the world later, and, you know, and that's like, by the time I'm in high school is when that's all sort of really taking root. Like we're starting to move beyond like the iPod phase and stuff like that into like the touchscreen phones. And even in high school for me, as that was just birthing into existence, and the quality of that stuff and the things you could do with it were still so new, you could already start to see the effect that that was having on us. And, you know, and I look back on those times and just wish that more adults had been like, you know, maybe we shouldn't just like headlong rush into just like dumping this out into the world en masse without thinking about what the effects of this is going to be on people, you know. And there's no going back now. This is the world we live in. But at the time, you know, I wish maybe more responsible people had been like, let's slow it down. And a lot of it comes to like individual initiative, right? Like you can't take all the responsibility away from parents and stuff, which isn't to say that people did anything wrong, right? Because nobody knew any better. Like you literally couldn't know that this is just like the way things would become when you're following this path, right? But we live in that world now, and that's just where we're at.
In your case, you were either privileged or smart enough to channel that bullying and channel the rejection, channel the violence that you were receiving towards something productive. But it seems like more and more we see kids not being able to channel that properly. We see mass shootings. We see a lot of mental health issues. What do you think could be a breakthrough in today's society when it comes to bullying at school and things like that?
I think the root of all of this, and I mean all of this, is just reestablishing a sense of human connection. You know, I think that's the thing that we've really sort of lost the most over these last 15 plus years, as technology has, especially at warp speed, overrun our lives. You know, is the need for genuine human connection in a very minutia sense, even in like daily interaction and stuff. You know, like I don't know, like it's a dumb analogy, but like when I was younger, right, like my friends and I would have to physically hang out with each other. You know, we couldn't just like hop on a game lobby together from each other, you know, from our own houses and just like FaceTime call in and like whatever, you know, you like got to go hang out at my friend's house, which means, you know, his mom will probably be like, oh, you know, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming over. Do you guys want, you know, like pizza rolls, stuff like that? Like human connection, right? Is like, and I think the hard part is we just lose so much of that because we have offloaded so much of the responsibility for acquiring our human connection into that device, right? And I think when you're that age, especially, so much of your development is really predicated on those kinds of human connections you make that help you kind of form your personhood, you know? And I think a lot of bullying is obviously the root of your inability to see the person across from you as a person like yourself, right? An ability to have that human connection with somebody, right? Because once you make that connection, once you are forced to see that person as an actual person in an equal light, your desire and willingness to be a jerk to that person diminishes pretty rapidly, right? Like once somebody is real to you,
Yeah, that empathy that you need.
yeah, once the consequences are real to you in terms of how this affects an actual real living human being, I think really is the meal ticket. But like generating human connection is hard, and I think that the bullying thing got way worse as I was growing up because at that time was when technology was even more pervasively jumping into our lives. Like again, like the thing for me, like until high school, we weren't really dealing with the iPhone thing, but like growing up, it was a lot of it was like online gaming, you know. In my generation, it was a lot of that, you know, like Xbox live chats and stuff like that. Like the beginnings of this idea that you can sort of live another life online where you really don't have the consequence for human emotion, you know, for other people, right? Like the other person is just a voice on the other side of the screen. Like they're not real, you know. Then obviously we all know that like if this person was in front of me, would I really just like look them in the eye and talk to them? Like, of course not, you know, but you can get away with it when you're, you know, just gaming online with people who are on the other side of the world and who you will never meet in person, who you'll never have to deal with the consequences of that. And when you're young, you know, I think that's a hard thing to have the responsibility of, you know, your ability to do that without understanding the consequence of that. I think it can be very formative. And I think it's an unfortunate thing that has really compounded societally over the time as even more technology has taken over that aspect of our lives, that human connection.
That brings about another topic that is related to what you're saying, and is that at least for my generation, you go to school, you experience whatever, but then you go home and you have another life. But with technology and what you're saying is almost like you go to school, you go out of school, you go home, and you're still connected.
Yes.
People still bullying you through social media. People are still harassing you through the games. Like there's no disconnection from one reality and the next.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. Well, it's for me the irony is that play that I was talking about having done in middle school that I helped co-write was a play about the dangers of cyberbullying. Because of how big of an issue that was in that time, right?
Wow.
Like that was literally like it was a whole narrative plot, but you know the whole back line of that was like, you know, the harmful effects of cyberbullying and how that, you know, diminishes us as people in, you know, in a very middle school kind of sense. But you know that was literally like just a handful of days after putting that play on was like when I got assaulted on the bus.
That made me think that makes me think that should be a great A24 film. You know, like you're writing the plays about this, and then you end up moving to another school because of that same reason.
Yep.
Man, that's totally filmmaking style.
Even at 14, the irony of that wasn't lost on me. I definitely recall thinking like a month or two after that happened, like, man, that's kind of crazy. Like we'd literally just put on a whole play for the school that we had spent all this time developing and researching and putting in our part to like, you know, have a discussion about this problem that was very new, right? At the time, like this idea of cyberbullying people was obviously really new. And we were only just starting to like become aware of its existence and feel its impact. And then to, you know, be real life bullied a few days later, they're like, gotcha. It's not cyberbullying you got to worry about.
Now, you had the chance to go to high school that was very focused on film.
Yeah.
Did you pursue film as a career after that, going to, you know, school necessarily, or what was your path into filmmaking as a career per se?
What I should have done is gone to school after. I'm just kidding. I mean, because for me, like, it's hard for me to articulate this to people because I think when I talk about like going to a film production high school as like my high school education, it probably sounds super cool, right? And it was really cool. But that school, so poor, so small. It was like 300 kids, you know? And again, half of those kids, if not more, were only there because it was also a credit recovery school for the kids who were otherwise going to fail out of normal high school. But they could come here, recover credits, and still graduate high school fairly easily. Like it was not a super hard school. But it just means I had like a lot of actual film production classes of substance that I took through high school, you know, and there were several of them that qualified as an equivalent for a traditional normal high school class, right? Like my advanced screenwriting class, I did instead of an advanced English class, right? And your history, like international cinema and history of cinema classes could qualify for your history classes, stuff like that. So, you know, I was like all in on that. And I did that, you know, all through school. As I said, in early 10th grade, when I started making my own narrative short films and stuff. And I was like, I want to do this for a career. That was the problem, is that at that age, at that moment, I was like, no, this is the path. Like, I didn't stop and think about anything else even, you know, despite, you know, my parents' protestations when I came home and was like, I'm going to be a movie guy. Like, it's like,
Well,
yeah, you know, again, I come from a very studious, well-to-do family of middle-class people with, you know, successful careers.
finance.
Yeah, exactly. You know, good schooling. Like my mom in her infinite strength while raising two kids and working full time got her bachelor's and master's degrees. You know, and very industrious people. And my father, you know, who wasn't raised in the best of circumstances financially, you know, raised by his grandma after his parents passed, you know, joined the military to help provide for me because my parents had me young, and really excelled because my dad is an incredibly hardworking man, and now, you know, is doing really well for himself in management in the FAA. You know, like, I come from a family of people who just, you know, they dig deep, they drive down, and they do well, but, you know, it's always in very respectable professional trades, you know, and then I come along, you know, the first of the new generation in the family, you know, I was the first of the grandchildren, all that. And I'm like, I want to be an art kid, you know, like, yeah. And my parents, you know,
We would do.
right. And my parents, God bless them, you know, were never like, no, you can't. But, you know, for them, you know, it was always the very soft, like, well, you know, what else could you do if that doesn't work? Or like, what are you going to do to sustain that while you like pursue that kind of career? Right. And I wish I'd heeded more of that advice. But yeah, I was so committed to this thing. Like, so early on, I was like, I'm doing this thing. I'm committed to this. This is the only path. My only goal is to make this my life, right? At a very early age. And so I figured the best way to do it was to literally do it, you know, like when I got out of high school, I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I had done so much film production in high school, right? Like, oh, if I had to look back, I think we made probably over 60 something short films in that time, and, you know, animations, and, you know, obviously we did classes in like editing, you know, and sound design, stuff like that. So, you know, I was decently well-rounded in the whole production process, you know, at a good level. And, I just felt ready. I was like, you know, I've been doing this. I've made so many movies. Like, the problem I had was a lot of the local schools were, the curriculum for like going to film school, like getting your start, like your associates and stuff,
Yep.
was basically just redoing all of high school.
Yeah.
And for me, I was like, I don't really want to, like, I don't know, spend thousands of dollars to go and relearn the things I did in high school, you know, like, it's great for all these other people who didn't have that opportunity. Like, I had to go to a film high school, you know, and they want to pursue this. But I was definitely the opinion at the time. I was like, I don't need this. I'm not, it wouldn't be a good use of my
I have
time.
YouTube for everything else.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, I'm just gonna do it. So out of high school, it was just for me, like, just pound the pavement and get the experience, try and get on as many sets as I could, and just learn it in real time on sets. With you know, rocky results. Utah doesn't have a huge film industry. There is an existence of one, but it's usually extremely seasonal, and it can't hold a lot of full-time professional filmmakers. So that was a bit of a cold reality to bump up against. But I through some, honestly, it's been so long now, I can't even recall how some of these things came together. But, you know, I was able to work on like directing and co-directing like a real estate TV show for a local news channel, where I was also like operating the camera, stuff like that. I got in through a family friend who owned a videography company, got to work for him, like doing wedding videos and editing for him and stuff like that. But, you know, for me, the whole time was like movies specifically, right? Like, that side of things was just like a way to stay involved and learn more of those skills, and pay some bills, but to continue to pursue the movie thing specifically. So, you know, I was always, you know, getting involved in the local film scene and working on short films on the weekends and stuff like that. But it was really hard going. It was not, it was a good time to be young. because the lack of responsibilities meant I could be dumb and reckless with my life decisions at that time, with less terrible consequence, definitely real consequence, but less impactful ones than if I were making those kinds of decisions now. So it was just really, for me, just mad scrambling, just jumping at every opportunity, working on sets, just trying to find an in, for me.
Do you think those were the kind of circumstances that motivated you to transition and move into Georgia?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there came a point where I was like, okay, I'm doing okay here in Utah. Like I had been starting to do okay for myself as like an indie DP, on like low paying projects and stuff like that, like short films that had some money, and stuff like that. But, for me, I knew it was like, okay, I sort of missed the bus on getting in on the class of people who became the people who were like full-time filmmakers in Utah now. Like I was just a few years behind the curve on getting in on that action. It's just kind of how that works. A lot of the old heads were retiring around a certain era, and a lot of the people who, like myself, were very driven and hardworking just happened to make those connections at that time. And by the time I was in that place, obviously not a very big industry. It's not a lot of room. And I also squandered a couple of good opportunities through, my own error, which is part of the process. You learn a lot when you make those kinds of mistakes. But I realized, like if I really want to do this, if I'm like committing to working in the film industry as my bread and butter, I got to go to the place where movies are being made, because they're not really being made here, and unless I want to work on like Hallmark movies for the rest of my life and then be like a B unit on a movie that comes through shooting some scenes in Utah for like Fallout or something, which is great. Like, don't get me wrong, like that's great stuff. And I know friends who worked on those from the local crew community, and that's awesome. But I was like, I want to be where the action is. And it just so happened that my dad had moved out here to Georgia for work in the mid 2010s. And so I'd had a chance to come out here and visit him a couple of times. And immediately I just fell in love with Georgia. Like it was like, there's so much green.
Like after Utah coming to Georgia.
Utah is in denial. Utah has so much grass that does not belong, that it takes up all of the water. And everybody is in denial about the fact that it is a dry brush desert. There's not really any naturally occurring green that's supposed to be there. It's all yellow brush. So to go to a place that was just green, like I could hardly even see buildings. It was all just green, was like weirdly like, it just was weirdly, spiritually uplifting. I don't know. It was just weird. Like flying into Georgia for the first time, looking out the plane window, I was like, wow. That's amazing. Like we did a lot of traveling when I was growing up, but it was never really to the East Coast. It was like a lot of West Coast stuff, some Caribbean, Mexico, stuff like that. But like I hadn't really spent any time in the South growing up. So I was just like dumbfounded. I was like, all the trees, there's history, there's age. This is one of the original 13 colonies, like there's just so much to this place. And it just felt so alive at the time, right? Like Georgia and Atlanta especially has just been a very important place to be in.
Things are diverse.
Very diverse. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I explain that to people. I talked about that a lot. The first couple of years I lived here, when people would ask me about that, I was like, yeah, I mean, the diversity is insane. Like just comparatively to where I came from, it was like, yeah, I cannot even hold a candle. And that for me, that was like one of the coolest parts, right? Like you get more women working in this industry here, people of different backgrounds, whether they have, are immigrants from other countries or just, people of different ethnicities and races, who are citizens, and working in this industry was like super cool to me. Cause like the only other people I knew back home were like maybe other Hispanics, for the most part, that was basically, other than that, it was white people, So I just, I fell in love with this place, and, after consultation with my wife, we decided it was a good move for our family to take the dive.
It is at this time that we met, in person, although we have met through a platform online of cinematographers that has transitioned into many other things at this point. But we met then finally in person, and we worked together. And the first time I saw you, you were with these military fatigues. And then the next time with this blue Navy type of, I was like, is this guy in the Army, in the Navy? What's the deal with Justus? And I know that people who know you, that's kind of like one thing that stands out. In me is like where's that curly mustache? Is that real?
Right, exactly.
And for you, it's like, are you real?
Right.
Where's that unique passion for the military style comes from?
I get a lot of people out there. Well, I won't say a lot of people. I've definitely had people out there accuse me of capping. I know I'll tell the haters right now I ain't capping. It was I when I thought back on it, like, because for me it was just like a thing I do, and I don't really think too much about that aspect of it. It's just like I like doing it. I work in an industry where I can do it, so I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
But when I sit down and kind of trace back that lineage, like I definitely was very into like costuming and dressing up and stuff growing up, and I did a lot of it in high school, like because for me, like, I wanted to make all these intriguing spy thrillers and action movies in high school, and we were making all that kind of stuff. And for me, that was like where I wanted to be, the kind of stuff I wanted to do. So it's always like piecing together military uniforms and cool outfits and stuff like that for, our little movies we were making. And I always just thought that was so fun, And so you would sometimes see me walking around school in like a black peacoat with like, olive green suspenders and like a helmet and boots, just like because we were like shooting a movie in between lunch or after school or for a class or something, and I was just like kitted up, And it's not just military stuff. I did a crazy amount of drag in high school, and
It's okay.
which I don't actually remember how that ended up happening. Just a lot of times I just ended up having to dress like a woman for things.
Oh my.
But I wasn't scared of it, right? Because especially in high school, I really kind of came into my own and my confidence and just enjoyed the theatricality of life, and that was just fun for me. So I think there's an element of that that's always just kind of been part of who I am.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, you get to a place where you're just working in this industry, which allows you a lot of freedom of expression because you're not in an office with, codes of conduct and dress codes and stuff like that. You're like, I do whatever I want, right? As long as I'm getting the job done, like, who cares, right? Like, and I take advantage of that. And it's one of my favorite things about it, It's just who I am. I'm a big history guy, as we've, obviously touched on. I'm a tragically fanatical history guy, and I tell people you can't even get me started on it because I just don't know when to stop. I can't turn it off. So,
But that's, I think, a good transition because I know that the fact that you dress like that sparks a lot of curiosity and a lot of comments.
Yes.
What are some of like anecdotes that you can tell from people coming up to you and being?
I definitely have a lot of weird stories, and a lot of it is like people first come up to me and ask me what, like, what are you wearing? What is this? And then the follow-up question is usually inevitably like, why? Because I don't get it. And sometimes I've told them straight up, I'm like, listen, man, I don't really get it either. I just like doing it. Like, but for me, it is also genuinely like, as a lover of history, there are things that I can do, that I can wear, that can generate that curiosity, right? Things that people aren't super familiar with and aren't the kind of things that they would learn about in school. But by seeing me in uniform and asking me these questions, I can have a conversation with them, provide them that a little bit of education in the time I can be provided for it. And they can take something new away from it, and maybe some, especially when it comes to history, the goal is when you learn better information, it can help shape your view of how the world works. Where things come from, all of that stuff to me, which is really important. So there's that element to why I do it, because I enjoy doing it, and I enjoy that it creates those opportunities to like talk to people about something I care about, and something that, if they're interested in, could kind of change sometimes their understanding of what they thought they knew about certain times in history or certain conflicts or all of that, which, again, which is the other problem, because then they're going to ask me about it, and I just cannot help myself but to just unleash. I really cannot. I got a problem.
You've taken this passion to the point that you are also participating in reenactments, and like this is like a whole subculture that is very different. How is that?
I mean, I kind of just dip my toes in that water a little bit. It's not really my thing yet.
Okay.
There's maybe a world where one day that is. For me, it's like it'll only happen when like the local CAF does like their World War II days. That's like a good excuse to toss us on. Or like recently, the Armor and Cavalry Collection had an open house, and I got to go see like at Fort Moore all of their armored vehicles. And I was like, oh yeah, this is a good opportunity. It's like just for me to live it, a little bit. But I'm not definitely not one of those like guys who like does the reenactment. It's like I'm part of a lot of those groups, not because I ever plan on participating, because most of them are like not in America. Not for the stuff I'm interested in. Like I'm not really like a Civil War or Revolutionary War kind of guy.
Okay.
I know a lot about them, but I'm not like interested in reenacting them. But for it's like well, they're all in Europe, so But I'm part of a lot of these groups just because for me it's fascinating when they like go into these crazy diatribes about like certain pieces of equipment and who would have worn them, like who would have been allowed to wear these hats and what style were they on, what side of the hat was the tassel on. Like I'd find that stuff deeply fascinating. Wow. And so I'm just in those groups just for the fun of like acquiring that information because sometimes it helps with how I wear or piece together certain uniforms I do already have.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm not quite the type to like jump in gung ho to like throw on the thing, grab a replica rifle and like go hang out in a trench with some dudes for a week. Not quite my vibe yet. Maybe one day, but.
So, do you always think of the Roman Empire, or what is your favorite period of history?
Oh man, I mean, I usually tell people that my specialty is usually about post-Renaissance era history, specifically European history, but certainly New World history and Asian history. So for me, it really kind of stems from the post discovery of the New World era, and I know a fair amount about the time before that, but it's the times that follow after that, all the way up through the modern age, that fascinate me the most because it's probably easiest to find the connections to the modern world. Right, by the more recent history within the last 400 years, it's a little easier to trace how those things have gotten us to here.
What are some of the events within that time period? Because sometimes, like you're describing, I'm thinking like, well, the world wars are part of it, kind of.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
that's kind of in between.
Definitely in there, yeah.
But what are the kind of like the major points in that period that you say, oh, I identify with this, I know this, I study this?
Yeah, like that's like the Age of Discovery, obviously, which was kind of capped by the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. And all
when you use the quotations.
Cristobal Colon, to all my friends back in España.
Yeah.
Sorry for the wrong S there. España. Yeah, and then following on to like the Age of Enlightenment, where there was a more of a political libertine thinking about like the divine right of rulers, but also the sense that they actually had responsibilities to the people they were governing was like starting to become the irony that it took until like the 1600s. They're like, is there a responsible way to just be an absolute dictator? Like, is there an ethical way for me to like have all the power but still like do right by my people?
So the French Revolution is part of that, or?
Yeah, I mean that comes along much later, right? Like that comes around in the late 1780s and early 1790s, but in the early 1600s and all of that is when the European powers especially are exploring the world and sounding all these colonies, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, Africa, and then obviously the New World just being picked to pieces and made into colonies for all sorts of powers, and how that kind of spirals into like the rise of the age of empires. And you have these empires like Spain and Portugal, which rule over vast territories of the world in this era, right? That are just like unparalleled wealth and power.
And traveling in ships.
Yeah, just like, and just trying to process like the machinations of an age like that where you didn't have instant communication, where things took forever to happen. The technology wasn't super advanced, or obviously medical knowledge was still very limited and growing, and just how that impacts like, and somehow we were still traveling and colonizing the world and doing terrible and great things all in this period, but how that affected, the rise of empires, which they're, in some ways were lifting these European classes of people into statuses unimaginable before in terms of wealth and power, and how these new political systems kind of form in that era based off of that. And then, as I said, kind of transitioning into, the Age of Enlightenment, and you're talking about the late 1600s, early 1700s with these ideas of like, we have the divine right of kings to rule, but do we have a responsibility at the same time to rule in a just manner and to hold ourselves responsible for doing things in the best interest of our people, Just because in the growing age of things like the printing press, like suddenly you had
Yeah.
accessibility, slightly more people were becoming literate, not like a crazy amount, but, more people certainly. And the religious classes were gaining that prominence by the access to
From Latin
literature.
to their native language and the Gutenberg press.
Yep. And, the rise of these new sects, religious sects being born in Europe out of like Lutheranism and Anglicanism and Catholic schism and all of that, and how that affects like all these groups of people having different power, different authority in all these regions, and how do you use that? How do you grow that and channel that into into people, right? And now you have these groups of people with the ability to talk to one another more easily across larger distances, to communicate ideas further and all of that. And then that sort of forces a direction of having to be more conscious, to be more worldly, to think about these things. That's usually you see the rise in like modern philosophy starting to take hold, and those philosophers starting to put those ideas to paper and stuff like that. But yeah, really, I mean, that whole era of growth through the 1700s, and then you have the craziness of the 1700s that led to like all of the wars of succession in Europe, which were basically some of our earliest world wars, and conflict.
Inspired in Latin America as well, like the succession of all these countries from the Spaniards and the Portuguese.
That would come along later, and that a lot of those roots were taking hold there with like political consciousness and stuff. And obviously the United States, born in this era from a lot of those same things, and how that evolved. Like for me, it definitely, like specifically within that era, I'm somebody who's fascinated with like the 19th century specifically, like the 1800s. To me is like something I just never stop loving to learn about.
Great. And if you find also value in these interviews, just remember to share it. And I'll see you in the next episode of Beyond the Scenes.